Welcome back to Traveling Dice. I'm Jason. I have another top 10 list for you today, the top 10 lores of magic in Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition. The magic phase is awesome. I love wizards. I love the idea of casting these really powerful spells that are swinging things mid-battle. And to me, the magic phase always kind of felt like this game within the game, right? A chess match within the battle. And there's so many facets to this chess match that make it really compelling. There are elements of luck, so I don't want to pretend even for a moment that the magic phase is all about strategy. It's not, especially in 8th edition, right? So you have the winds of magic, totally random. The number of power dice you're going to get, or you just outnumbered your dispel dice compared to your opponent's power dice? Or do you have the upper hand in any given situation? And this has a lot of randomness to it, right? So if the winds of magic are a 6 and 1, the power and dispel dice are fairly equal. Especially, they might even actually be equal if you manage to channel and your opponent doesn't. As opposed to your opponent rolls boxcars for the winds of magic. Then you only have half the dispel dice as your opponent. So there are other facets to this chess match, though. It's this identifying what spell is the most critical for your opponent to cast and recognizing how many dice they're likely to throw at that. Really thinking about when you want to use your Dispel Scroll and recognizing the power of that and the potential of shutting down your opponent's magic phase for one turn. But you don't want to use it, you don't want to waste it, right? You don't want to use it in a spot where it's not critical. And then from the offensive side, thinking about how are you drawing out your opponent's dispel dice on something that you think is not as important as one of your other spells. How are you drawing out your opponent's dispel scroll early? That way it's not available at a critical moment later on. So these types of things always fascinated me. And the magic phase was always the phase where I definitely was just on the edge of my seat. And much more so than any other phase of the game, right? The movement phase is you're kind of observing what your opponent's doing, or you already thought about what you're doing, and it's just kind of executing. The shooting phase, granted there's gun lines and stuff, but it never just had me on the edge of my seat. And then the close combat phase, everything's kind of committed, right? You kind of know what's going on, and there's not many surprises. Now, granted, the dice can swing a certain way and surprising the combat phase, but you kind of know what's up. But the magic phase is just real swingy, especially in 8th edition. So when I consider how powerful I think a lore of magic is and where I'm going to rank it here, obviously all these lists are subjective, right? So these are based not only on my opinions, but also my experiences, either using the lores or going up against the lores. And even though I've played a fair amount of Warhammer, right, there's a limited sample size when I go off of my experience. But I consider things, the lore attribute, how does the lore synergize with the army or armies in general? The signature spell, I think the signature spell is really critical, right? Because the signature spell is a spell that you can guarantee, right? So if it's a really good spell, you have that in your hip pocket, right? When I roll spells, I know I can deviate one of those spells to the signature spell, and it's awesome. Or is the signature spell is kind of meh, and then that really impacts my viewpoint of a lore. Also, does the lore have a spell that is potentially game winning? Because there's a lot of lores in Warhammer that I feel very strongly do have game winning spells or potentially game winning spells. So these are the types of things I'm looking at and considering for this particular list. Without further ado, getting over to the list, in the 10th spot, we have the Lore of Nurgle. All right, so as we look at the lore attribute for the Lore of Nurgle, you have to actually divide this out into two different versions. You have the version from the Warriors of Chaos list, which is when you cast a spell, you roll a d6. On a roll of a 6, you're adding +1 wound and +1 toughness to the wizard for the rest of the game. So I think that's amazing. And if you get lucky and get a handful of 6s, that wizard becomes really difficult to kill. So I really like that. The version in the Demons of Chaos list is okay in my mind. So as you're causing wounds from this lore, you roll a d6 for each wound cause, and potentially you're increasing the unit size of Plague Bearers and Nurglings. Plague Bearers, for each unsaved wound cause, it's adding a model on a 5 or 6, and for Nurglings, you're adding a model on a 6. So I don't think that's as good as the Warriors of Chaos one in my mind, but still decent. All right, so I'm not going to read every spell to you. They're here. If you want to pause it and read them, you can, but I think that might be a little on the boring side. So I'm just going to give some thoughts. The signature spell I think is good. It has a low casting cost of 7, so level 4 is only going to have to throw 2 dice. It does have a short range, but no armor saves, the teardrop template. So overall, I think it's nice. I think some of the other spells in the lore are better. In fact, I think maybe all the other spells are better. So I think in certain matchups, I would take it, but in other matchups, I would definitely probably pass on it. All right, so looking at the number 1 spell, Miasma of Pestilence. This spell is going to reduce weapon skill and initiative. Out of all the stats you can reduce, I think weapon skill and initiative are the least impactful in my opinion, although they can certainly impact the combat. So I definitely wouldn't completely poo-poo it, but it's not the most exciting spell in the lore to me. The nice thing is the casting cost of 5+. So you could definitely just keep 1 die held back at the end, and you're just throwing that 1 die, and you have a decent chance of casting this, even with a level 2. And it can be boosted to reduce the weapon skill by D3. Now, reducing weapon skill by D3 is much more tempting than just by 1. But yeah, it can have a definite impact on a combat. So the number 2 spell, Blades of Petrification. This is essentially just going to augment one of your friendly units to have poison. If they already have poison, they're going to poison auto hit on a 5 or a 6. So to me, this is more useful for the demons and hitting the plague bearers with this. They already have poison. Going from a 6-up poison to a 5-up poison is really, really appealing. Just throwing poison on some other troops, it's going to be hit or miss. Some of the other troops already have a high strength, so the plague bearers are only strength 4. Sometimes they struggle to wound, so boosting their poison is really nice. It casts on an 8+, which again, looking at these spells in this lore, the casting values are actually pretty low overall, which is really great because you can force your opponent to have to dispel a lot of spells. All right, so looking at Curse of the Leper, the number 3 spell, this is where I actually start to get a lot more excited about the lore. This is either an augment or a hex spell, so it has a lot of versatility depending on the situation. If you're using it as an augment, it is increasing a unit's toughness by D3. If you're using it as a hex, it is decreasing the unit's toughness by D3. So as you're modifying toughness, this has a much greater impact in my mind than something like weapon skill. And it's automatically D3, so that doesn't have to be boosted. And yeah, you're either preserving your guys by increasing their toughness by D3, or you're just dealing out a ton more damage potentially by reducing your opponent's toughness. This has an 18-inch range, which is decent, but it can also be boosted to a 36-inch range, and a 36-inch range is just massive. The number 4 spell is Rancid Visitations. This is a magic missile spell. It only has a range of 18 inches. I would love to see a 24-inch range here, but that's my only complaint. It's doing D6 strength 5 hits. Nice. And then the unit that's being targeted has to take a toughness test. And if they fail it, they take another D6 strength 5 hits. And they keep doing that until they pass that test. Now, obviously, that synergizes very well with Curse of the Leper, because you're potentially getting a unit down to toughness 1 with that spell, and then all of a sudden, Rancid Visitations is just going to do a massive amount of damage, potentially. I mean, your opponent could roll that 1 right off the bat, but they might not roll the 1 for 5, 6, 7, 8. They might be taking 8 D6 strength 5 hits from the spell if you have Curse of the Leper on them. So a lot of synergy there. I like it a lot. All right, so the number 5 spell is Fleshy Abundance. So this is an augment spell. It's got an 18-inch range. It's going to give a unit regeneration 5+. If they already have regeneration, it's going to boost it by +1 to a maximum of 2+. This can be cast so that it's impacting all friendly units within 18 inches on a 22+. So that's where I think the bread and butter is. I actually think the spell is a lot better for the Warriors of Chaos than it is the demons, because you can't take the ward save and the regen. So unlike maybe the Blades of Petrification, I like the Warriors taking the number 5 spell. And I think that on the Warriors, bubbling it so it's hitting all units within 18 inches, which potentially is all your units, depending upon the layout of the battlefield, I think that's potentially a game-winning spell, depending upon the moment. And the number 6 spell is Plague Wind. This is a magical vortex. And it's going to use the small round template. Any model hit by the template is suffering a wound if they fail a toughness test. And this allows for no armor saves, although ward saves are allowed. And the models that fail to save only take 1 wound. So if you're talking about a multi-wound model, it's not going to remove them. It's not as good as the other vortexes, and I'm not going to pretend that it is. But I do think, given the situation, it's potentially a game-winning spell. It's really good against elves, whereas some of the other vortexes that focus on initiative aren't as good. So it's a little matchup dependent too, I think. But yeah, a potentially game-winning spell, I think, no doubt. Heading over to the 9th spot, we have the Lore of Heavens. And the first thing we'll focus on is the lore attribute. So I'm going to be a little critical here on the lore attribute because I do love the rest of the lore. The lore attribute to me is kind of meh. You're going to deal an extra d6 strength 4 hits if your target is an enemy unit that has the fly special rule. So this is really situational. I mean, you're going to face some armies that don't have any units that have fly, like orcs and goblins, the ogres. So there's plenty of armies that aren't going to be fielding a bunch of flying units. And, so when it comes up, it might make a big difference, but there'll be battles where it just doesn't come up at all. As the signature spell, we have Ice Shard Blizzard, a really nice hex spell. Cast on a 7+, so it's really easy to cast. It has a range of 24 inches and can be boosted to 48, and boosting it only requires a 10+. This spell is going to give -1 to hit rolls, both for shooting and close combat. So applying a -1 is way different than changing the weapon skill. Applying the -1, in my opinion, is better. This situationally, when you're changing the weapon skill, maybe there's times where it doesn't even have a big effect or any effect at all. But giving that -1 and allowing it to be something that impacts shooting is really, really good. If you target War Machine with this spell, it's losing its shooting on a 4+. So that's also devastating for some of your armies that are going to have really, really powerful artillery. The number 1 spell is Harmonic Convergence, which is an augment spell. And it's casting on just a 6+, so you're really probably only throwing 2 dice at this spell, unless you're really wanting to get it off. But this augment allows for the unit to re-roll to hit, to wound, and armor save rolls of 1. So I would say it's good. It's probably not game-breaking, but a really handy spell. I'm not going to say too much about Wind Blast. You have the text there. To me, it's kind of a meh spell. This is probably one I'm swapping out for the signature if I roll it up. I think maybe situationally it's useful, but generally I don't think it's going to have a big impact at all. Curse of the Midnight Wind is kind of the opposite of Harmonic Convergence. It's a hex, and it forces your opponent to re-roll 6s to hit, to wound, and armor saves. And it can be boosted to hit every enemy unit within 12 inches. So I think that this is a great spell. Actually, situationally, it might depend on whether it's better than Harmonic Convergence. Obviously, if you can get both those spells off, I think that totally transforms the combat. But just a useful hex spell that your opponent kind of has to be mindful of. The number 4 spell is Uranin's Thunderbolt. This is casting on a 10+, it's 24-inch range, magic missile, D6, strength 6 hits. You don't see strength 6 magic missiles all that often, so that's really what draws my attention in on this spell, strength 6. And it's got a nice range of 24 inches, and that range can be boosted to 48, and you're only casting that on a 13+. When you're going with the 48. Now, I think this spell actually synergizes with the lore attribute fairly well, because you might be targeting one of those flying monsters or something. I know I said I didn't like the lore attribute, which I don't, but I think that this spell probably synergizes better than some of the other spells with it. But strength 6 magic missile, it's awesome. The number 5 spell is Comet of Cassandora. When I look at this spell, I really think, okay, this is a great spell to deal with war machines, especially war machines that maybe are clumped up together, or gun lines. Other than that, I think the use of the spell is a little limited, but if you have things in your opponent's army that either can't move or struggle to move or don't want to move because they're not able to fire, then placing the marker by them, I think, is really, really effective. Now, if your opponent has a lot of fast mobile stuff, then I think that they're going to just have an opportunity to avoid it or move away from it. So situationally, an amazing spell depending upon the matchup. Now, looking at the number 6 spell, which is Chain Lightning. This spell is casting on a 15+, which is a nice low casting value considering the potential damage here caused by this spell. And sometimes you see the number 6 spells and they have a casting value of 18 or even up to 21. And these are numbers that can be difficult to reach. But 15... potentially you're hitting that with 3 or 4 dice with a level 4. Probably 4 dice if you want to hit it consistently. But it's a reasonable amount. Now, Chain Lightning also can impact the way your opponent deploys. So just the threat of it, I think, has a certain impact because it does D6 strength 6 hits. It's got a range of 24 inches, but it has the potential of jumping and hitting another unit within 6 inches on a 3+. So if having this spell and the threat of this spell is forcing your opponent to change their plan in terms of deployment and maneuvering, I think that's just a win already. Even if the spell ultimately can't be used to jump from one unit to another, you're forcing your general to spread his forces out. You're forcing your general to perhaps go without the Inspiring Presence or the BSB because everything's kind of spread out. And for certain armies, spreading out is a huge challenge, right? Your horde armies spring to mind for sure. So in that case, when spreading out's not an option, you have the potential of just hitting many units with this particular spell. It's awesome. Jumping over to the 8th spot, we have the Lore of Fire. The Lore of Fire is a great lore, and it's really helped too by the fact that every army, or almost every army, has access to the Ruby Ring of Ruin. So essentially, you're able to take the signature spell twice, a lesser version of the signature spell. It's not boosted, of course, on the Ruby Ring of Ruin. And then we'll look at the lore attribute here, and we have Kindle Flame. Kindle Flame, essentially, when you damage a unit with a direct damage spell or magic missile from the Lore of Fire, on subsequent spells, you're going to add D3 to the casting value. So it's a good lore attribute. I don't necessarily think it's great because, your opponent might stop that first spell, and then, as you run out of dice, it's not going to help you. But it does have that added just chess match factor of like, if I use Fireball, or if I use the Ruby Ring of Ruin, if you don't stop that, then I'm going to have an easier time casting other direct damage spells on that unit, which if you're already targeting with one spell, you're probably going to want to target it with others. So I like it. I think it's a good lore attribute. The signature spell in the Lore of Fire is Fireball. This is such a versatile spell. I really love this signature spell. It's probably one I'm always going to deviate one of my slots to, regardless of if I'm a level 4 or a level 2, whatever the case may be. It's just so good. So looking at the base spell, you have a 24-inch range. You're doing D6 strength 4 hits, and these are flaming. So that's great, but it has the boost ability. And when you boost this spell, you're also boosting the range, right? So you can boost it 1 level up, 36-inch range, 2d6, or you can boost it all the way up to 48-inch range and 3d6. Now that is going to require an 18+ to cast, so you're getting into those higher level spells at that point. But even boosting it once, only a 10+. So if you're a level 4, you're only needing to probably throw 2 dice at that. It's just great. And a 48-inch range, I mean, you're talking about going across essentially the whole battlefield. And you can do that on turn 1. You don't have to be so focused about range. I think range comes into play a lot with some of the other lores. It's a really handy signature spell. So looking at Cascading Fire Cloak, you kind of have 2 types of either augments or hexes. You have the ones that are until your next magic phase. The nice thing about those are you know they're going to be in play. You know once it's cast, it's not going to be dispelled. You know how long it's going to be in effect. And then you have remains in play spells, right? So remains in play spells, you don't really have a great sense of how long they're going to be in effect. Your opponent could potentially dispel them during their magic phase on their next turn. But the nice thing about remains in play spells is that your opponent has to deal with it at some point. So they have to commit dice. If they're dispelling it on their turn, it means they're not using those dice as an offensive magical attack, right? They're using those dice as defense in their turn. I think it's a win. The huge bonus on this is that you can cast this spell with just 1 die pretty easily. Now, granted, if you roll 1 or a 2, regardless of your wizard level, it's going to be a fail. But on a 3+, you're casting this even with a 2nd level wizard. So if you can just set 1 die aside and your opponent's used all their dispel dice to stop some of your other spells or one of your other big spells, and then you can just toss this at the end of your magic phase, and you're pretty good odds of casting it. And then that just means it remains in play until your opponent deals with it. So either they forget and then they're taking the 2d6 strength 4 hits at a later date, which depending upon the unit could be devastating, or they're committing dice at a later time, which could be brutal for them as well. Flaming Sword of Ruin is an augment giving a unit +1 bonus when rolling to wound. This is huge. With all shooting and close combat attacks, and it's until the start of the caster's next magic phase. This is also another spell that's super easy to cast. It casts on an 8+. So again, a level 4 is having no problem casting this with 2 dice. Maybe even, it's a 50-50 with even 1 die. So again, there's a strategy in the magic phase of just casting a lot of spells, because that can be really hard to overcome as the dispeller. And I think Lore of Fire so far is really hitting upon that idea that I can just overwhelm you with the sheer volume of spells. And +1 to wound, that totally, absolutely can turn a combat. So as I look at the Burning Head, the number 3 spell, I have to admit this is kind of a meh spell for me. I think situationally it's good. It does cause a panic check if the unit takes a wound, so depending upon your matchup, that might be useful. But overall, I think this is probably the spell. If I roll it up, I'm swapping it for the signature. All right, the number 4 spell, Piercing Bolts of Burning. This is situationally very good. It casts on a 10+. It is doing D3 strength 4 hits for each rank of 5 or more models in the target unit. It has a 24-inch range. So, yeah, sometimes in 8th edition, you're going to see massive units with lots and lots of ranks, right? And this is one of those spells that is great for whittling down some of these units. And yeah, situationally, I think it's absolutely phenomenal. If your opponent's running a bunch of small units, obviously it's not as good. But I think in 8th ed, a lot of armies are going to run some bigger units. The number 5 spell, Fulminating Flame Cage. In my opinion, this is the best spell in the lore. I think it's even better than the number 6 spell. It does D6 strength 4 hits on a unit within 24 inches. It's a hex. You don't even need line of sight. And if that unit moves in their turn for any reason, every model in the unit suffers a strength 4 hit. That's awesome. This puts your opponent in a bind, right? Do I not move that unit? And obviously, you're going to be targeting probably really large units with this, right? Units with a lot of models. So if your opponent's running something crazy like a unit with 50 models, which is not unheard of, especially in 8th ed, then they have to decide, do I want every model in that unit to take a strength 4 hit? And granted, not every unit's going to have a great armor save, right? Not every unit's going to have a great toughness. So I'm thinking of elves, a big block of swordmasters or white lions. They're not going to want to move if they have this on them. Strength 4 against toughness 3, you're talking about a ton of wounds. And those guys don't have great armor saves. So granted, this spell is obviously not super useful against smaller units or units with heavy armor and not a lot of models, but situationally, it's just amazingly good. And if your opponent chooses not to move the unit and take that damage, then that's a huge win for you. I'll also point out this spell is being cast on an 11+, which is, I just think, a steal of a deal. You can boost the range up to 48 inches, and then it's only requiring a 14+. I think the casting value of that is way too low for what it potentially does. So the number 6 spell is Flamestorm. The one thing I really like about this as a number 6 spell is it's easy to cast, a 13+, and that's much lower than your typical level 6 spell. But I do think there's a reason for that. I don't think it's as powerful as your typical level 6 spells. I would describe the spell as good, not great. It's doing D6 strength 4 hits using the round template, and it's scattering D6 inches. So you're going to have instances where you scatter and don't hit many guys. And, it is what it is. I think it's a good spell overall. All right, in the number 7 spot, we have the Lore of Metal. The lore attribute for the Lore of Metal, I think, is quite good. So essentially, the Lore of Metal attribute, metal shifting, you're wounding the target when you're doing like a magic missile or direct damage spell based on that target's armor save. So if the target has a 5-up armor save, you're going to wound on a 5-up. So obviously in that situation, it's not that great. But you're going to see lots of units in some of the elite armies that have 1-up armor saves, 2-up armor saves, and so forth. So wounding those guys on anything but a 1 is really good. These are also counting as flaming attacks. There'll be some situations where you're going up against a Dragonbane Gym, and that's not ideal. But there'll be other situations where you're going up against Regen, and it's amazing. So overall, as a lore attribute, I like it a lot. In most matchups, especially those with heavily armored troops, I'm always going to be taking the signature spell, I think, which is Searing Doom. It does D6 hits. Again, that's wounding based on the target's armor save. It's got a 24-inch range, and you can boost it to 2d6. If your opponent's got anything that's got a 1-up armor save, this spell is just amazingly good. All right, I think the number one spell here helps me rationalize the ranking of this lore, because I think one of the criticisms of the lore would be, okay, well, I'm not always going to be going against armies that have exceptionally good armor, right? There's plenty of armies that don't focus on armor. Orcs and goblins tend to not have really high armor, for example. Demons of Chaos tend to not have exceptionally good armor, for example. So Plague of Rust, right? This is a hex. It's got a 24-inch range, and what it does is it permanently reduces the target's armor save by 1, right? So if you had a 4-up armor, you go to a 5-up armor for the remainder of the game. This is being cast on only a 7+ too, so you're easily throwing, 1 or 2 dice, probably 2 if you want to, kind of guarantee that it's going through. But that's permanent, and you can cast it on the same unit again on a subsequent turn, right? So this can definitely have a compounding effect, and that over time, or even honestly casting it once, could sway a combat potentially if you're taking away the saves or eliminate them altogether. The number 2 spell, Enchanted Blades of Aben. This is giving a augment to a unit, adding +1 bonus when rolling to hit with all shooting and close combat attacks. So I would describe this as a good augment. +1 to hit's nice. The attacks also count as magical and armor piercing. So that's great, if you're dealing with something like an ethereal unit or heavily armored unit, just adding that extra punch, or certainly ethereal, just probably eliminating them altogether with these magical attacks. And you can potentially boost this to 48 inches. It's another spell that's really easy to cast on a 9+. Glittering Robes is another really nice augment spell, so casting only on a 9+, and it's giving the target a 5-up scaly skin. So this is really nice. You're talking about maybe an infantry unit that has heavy armor or heavy armor and shield. You go from a 4-up armor save down to a 2-up armor save. All of a sudden, you're walking around like your heavy calf. And this one can actually be boosted to hit all friendly units within 12 inches. So just a super handy augment spell, like it. The number 4 spell is Gehenna's Golden Hounds. I have to admit, this one doesn't thrill me. I think it's situationally good. It has a short range, 12 inches. That can be boosted to 24. It's doing D6 hits, and it allows you to single out a character in a unit. But here's the downside. That character still benefits from the Lookout Sir roll. They do have to roll it for each hit. So, you probably see 1, maybe 2 ones in there if you're lucky. But I just kind of look at it and go, meh, I think this is one I'm swapping out for Searing Doom. The number 5 spell, Transmutational Lead, is a nice hex spell. It's got a range of 24 inches. It can be boosted to 48. It's only needing a 12+ to cast. Level 4 is probably using 3 dice. Not too bad. It gives -1 to weapon skill, ballistic skill, and armor saves. The and armor saves is really the tipping point for me until the start of the caster's next magic phase. So, you couple that up with Plague of Rust, and all of a sudden in one round, you can give a unit -2 to the armor save. Really nice. All right, the number 6 spell, Final Transmutation. This is just an amazing spell. It's casting on a 15+, which for what it does, I think is super reasonable. It's got an 18-inch range, direct damage spell. You're rolling a D6 for every model in the target unit, and on a 5+, it's been turned to gold. It's removed as a casualty with no saves of any kind allowed. Man, that's just awesome. Models with more than 1 wound on their profile are only affected on a roll of a 6. Okay, still great. So this is why it's not as good as Dwellers, right? Because it's only going to impact characters on a 6 potentially. But some of those characters are going to have Strength 5 anyway, so maybe it's the same as Dwellers in certain situations. Just a really awesome spell. Your opponent's got to be terrified of this. If they have a huge unit of really elite troops, this is just devastating. And then in addition to that, there's actually even icing on the cake here. Any enemy unit within 12 inches of the target at the start of the following turn, including the target itself, must test for stupidity. Okay, they probably have a BSB. Maybe it's not going to make a difference, but yeah, it's just super helpful. And you can boost the range of the spell to 36 inches. This spell, I can't understate it, is just amazingly good. I think you're always taking it if you roll it up. Jumping over to the 6th spot, we have the Lore of Beasts. This is a really awesome lore, and starting off with the lore attribute. So lore attribute I think is decent. It's going to reduce the casting cost of the lore beast spells if you're targeting anything from the army of beastmen or anything that are war beasts, cavalry, monstrous cavalry, chariots, monsters, or swarms. Now the signature spell of this lore is really where this lore shines in my opinion. Wissenden's Wild Form. I think this is actually the best signature spell in all of Warhammer 8th edition, in my opinion. It is an augment spell. It's giving a unit +1 strength and +1 toughness. It's casting on only a 10+, which I think is a bargain. And it has a 12-inch range, which can be boosted to 24 inches. And boosting it only brings it up to a 13 to cast. This is an amazing spell. I think this totally flips a combat in your favor. Or if it's a coin flip, I think this absolutely just tips the scales of balance on a particular combat. +1 strength, you're going to expect to do significantly more damage, punching through more armor, and +1 toughness, you're just going to take fewer wounds. So it accomplishes both things. It's an amazing spell. The number 1 spell is the Flock of Doom. This is casting on a 5+. It's 2d6 strength, 2 hits, and a magic missile. And it can be boosted to 48-inch range. It's only on an 8+ to boost it to 48-inch range. So I kind of go in on this spell. I think situationally it's really good, depending upon the matchup. If you're facing a lot of War Machines, I actually like it against War Machines because if you're hitting a War Machine with Magic Missile, you probably need 6s to wound anyways, right? Even with Fireball or something that's a higher strength. So I kind of like utilizing the lower strength on something that has really high toughness because, you're going to need a 6 anyways. So War Machines 2d6 strength 2 hits, you expect to get 1, maybe 2 if you're lucky of those through, and then you can start knocking out some War Machines. And against Elves, you're wounding on 5s. So I do like this spell in those matchups, but in other matchups, I'm probably switching this for the signature. Pan's Impenetrable Pelt is a number 2 spell, and I really like the idea of boosting this spell to affect all characters within 12 inches. It's giving the characters that are affected +3 toughness. So this is really good, especially if you have, say, your Wizard, your BSB, and your General all in the same unit. They're all getting +3 toughness. Having multiple characters in the unit allows you to put the characters at the corner of the units. And this is probably going to force your opponent to put attacks into them despite the high toughness. So they're almost certainly going to be wounding on 6s most likely. Maybe 5s if they're particularly high strength, but 5s or 6s. And this is going to mitigate a lot of your opponent's attacks going into this really high toughness. So I think a really handy spell. All right, the Amber Spear, number 3 spell. This is a really versatile spell in my opinion. So it essentially works like a bolt thrower, but it has the option of boosting it. If you boost it, it's strength 10. Instead of doing D3 wounds, it's doing D6 wounds. So the range is a little limited. It's 24-inch range. Ideally, I wish that was a little bit more, but still, I think you can get the job done with 24-inch range. If you're boosting it, this allows you to potentially go after War Machines. All of a sudden, the War Machines, which are toughness 7 typically, are being wounded on a 2+, and you have D6 wounds, you're probably taking them off. So bye-bye Cannon, bye-bye Bolt Thrower, bye-bye Stone Thrower. Awesome. And then there's plenty of monsters that's just great against. So yeah, it's something that's handy, especially for armies like Beastmen that maybe struggle to take down some of these things with range. Very good spell. The Curse of Unryn here is the number 4 spell, just a handy little hex spell, -1 penalty to hit rolls. This is shooting and close combat, and it has a nice range, 36 inches, which can be boosted to 72 inches. 72 inches, unless you're just playing on a massive table, that's the whole battlefield. So I love the range on this spell. It does force your opponent also to consider all things as dangerous terrain, and they fail on a 1 or 2. So, just a little added bonus there. But the -1 penalty hit is nice. The number 5 spell, the Savage Beast of Horos. This falls in the same category as the number 2 spell for me. I like it in a unit that has multiple characters. It can be bubbled to affect all characters within 12 inches, including the Wizard. And it's giving them +3 strength and +3 attacks until the start of the next magic phase, next caster's magic phase. So yeah, if you're giving 3 characters +3 strength, +3 attacks, that's 9 additional attacks. And yeah, the strength is probably getting you, even if you're strength 3, you're all of a sudden strength 6. But your general and your BSB are probably either strength 4 or 5. And that's bringing them up to probably at least strength 7, depending upon, what weapons they have, and maybe even higher. So that's really good. I think that is potentially a real devastating spell, depending upon the matchup, depending upon your characters. And I think that depending upon the right combat, I think that might be a game winner right there. All right, so the number 6 spell, which is Transformation of Kadan. I would say that this is a good spell. I don't think it's one of the better number 6 spells in my opinion, but it's a remains in play spell. What it effectively is transforming your wizard into a monster until that guy's either killed or it's dispelled. I think I would definitely eye the Mountain Chimera if I was going to transform into one of these monsters, which involves boosting the spell, which is fine. And you do turn into a really devastating monster, right? The Mountain Chimera has 46 attacks plus 1 because he's frenzied. He's weapon skill 7, strength 7, so that's, you're looking at probably 15 attacks, weapon skill 7, strength 7. That's pretty brutal. I would expect to get probably 8 to 9 wounds through on that. And he's got a breath weapon, which is strength 4. So yeah, definitely devastating for sure. And he's going to have a massive footprint. You still stay in the unit, so you have to juggle that. I think it's a good spell, but when you compare it to some of the other level 6 spells, I think it comes up a little short. In the 5 spot, we have the Lore of High Magic. So looking at the lore attribute is actually a little bit complex because we have 3 different armies that can take this particular lore, and they all have a different lore attribute depending upon the army. So the High Elves, if a High Elf wizard casts this until the next magic phase, friendly magic phase, it's giving his unit +1 ward save to a max of 3+. I think that that's very good. And if you're in a unit like Phoenix Guard that already have a ward save, just casting 1 spell is getting those guys up to a 3-up ward save. It's also offering some defense for your wizard. Very, very good. If you're a Lizardman, it's allowing you to swap spells. To me, of the 3, I think that's the one I like the least. It feels situational to me and kind of random because you're rolling for the new spell. But, there's plenty of decent signature spells out there, so maybe it's good. And then the Wood Elf one, I think I actually like the most. And the Wood Elf one, when you cast a spell, you put a counter next to the unit. When the unit or any character in the unit suffers an unsaved wound, then you're removing that counter and counting the wound as though it had been saved. So I think that's the best. Like, it's just going to be there until it comes into effect, and I like it a lot. But the High Elf one, very strong as well. The Lore of High Magic actually has 2 signature spells, which is nice. Gives you a lot of versatility. The first one is Drain Magic, which can be either an augment or a hex spell. It's casting on only a 7+, which can be boosted to impact all units within 18 inches. If you're casting it on friendly units, then it's dispelling any remains in play spells as well as any currently active spells. So these are going to be the spells that say until the start of the caster's next magic phase. So that's handy because, if your units are hexed, you can get rid of that hex instantly with this spell. Likewise, if your enemy units are augmented with something, you can get rid of all of those. So it's a super handy spell. Ideally, you're just trying to stop those spells from being cast, but of course, your opponent's going to be able to get something through. So having this in your tool bag, I think, is very good. All right, the other signature spell is Soul Quench. Now, I know I just said that Whistling's Wild Form is the best signature spell in the game, but I think this one would be a competitor in that conversation. It's really good. The only thing I really dislike about it is the range. 18 inches can feel a little close and can limit you in the early game unless you're just advancing forward at a really fast pace. But it's only 8 inches to cast, and it's doing 2d6 strength 4 hits. And if you're willing to go up to a 16+ to cast, it can be boosted to 4d6 strength 4. That's really good damage for a signature spell. The number 1 spell is Apotheosis. And this one is kind of meh to me. It's situationally good. And it has a range of 18 inches, and it's healing a single lost wound on the target. So it's an augment. And it can be boosted to heal D3 lost wounds. So, it can bring up your Phoenix or your Tree Man, depending upon what army you're in, or the Lizardmen have a ton of monsters that potentially benefit from this. In fact, maybe if you are Lizardmen using High Magic, maybe I like this spell more than some of the other ones. But even in that scenario, I think some of the other spells in the lore really outshine this one, in my opinion. The number 2 spell is Hand of Glory. This one I really like. It's casting on a very low casting value of 5+, and you are augmenting a unit within 18 inches to increase their weapon skill, ballistic skill, initiative, or movement by D3. So these all have good situational options. The ballistic skill really stands out to me because you could have a nice big block of archers, or maybe you're hitting your bolt thrower. Those are great. Like all of a sudden the bolt thrower, you can fire that single bolt and potentially be hitting on a 2+. or your block of archers all of a sudden probably hitting on 2s. Strikes me as being very good, but the weapon skill can help, right? D3 get some of your elite forces potentially up to weapon skill 8, which is just kind of crazy. And you can boost all 4 of those if you want to boost it, and it's only a 10 plus to cast, so a handy spell. All right, the number 3 spell, Walk Between Worlds. This allows a unit within 24 inches to make a 10-inch move, or if you boost it, a 20-inch move, as though they were ethereal, right? So you can move through impassable terrain, you can go through terrain with no problem. You can't end in impassable terrain, of course, but yeah, just a super handy spell. A 20-inch move is really far, right? So you can set up in your opponent's flank, potentially. You can do things with a spell that your opponent just doesn't see coming. I really like it. The number 4 spell is Tempest, which kind of compares to the number 6 spell in the Lore of Fire, Flamestorm. But I actually think it's better than Flamestorm, which is kind of crazy since Flamestorm is supposed to be the number 6 spell, super powerful in the Lore of Fire. Now, the Tempest spell has a range of 30 inches, which is the same. It uses the large round template just right off the bat. You don't even have to boost it, which the Flamestorm one uses a small round template. Tempest is strength 3, whereas Flamestorm is strength 4. But even with the large round template, it's only scattering d6 inches. So if you boost Flamestorm up to the larger template, it scatters 2d6 inches. So I think that that's a huge difference. And yeah, of course, the lower strength is going to come into play a lot. So I don't want to downplay that. But there's plenty of targets out there that strength 3 is going to be pretty brutal against, right? A lot of elves, even like orcs and goblins if it's a squig herd or something. So there's a fair amount of lower toughness stuff out there. And even still, the higher toughness stuff, wounding on 5s isn't the end of the world. It also provides a little bit of a hex for your target. So until the start of the caster's next magic phase, the unit has -1 modifier to hit rolls. And this is both shooting and close combat. So I think it's a really good spell. And impressively good for a number 4 spell. The number 5 spell, Arcane Unforging. I love this spell. Direct damage spell, range 24 inches, nice range. It's doing a single wound to a character, and that wound is wounding based on the character's armor save. So kind of like the lower metal in that respect. If they're not wearing armor, then this wound can't wound them. But regardless, you have an opportunity of destroying a magic item, which is chosen randomly. So magic items are super powerful, right? If you're getting rid of your opponent's armor, getting rid of a Dispel Scroll, getting rid of your opponent's magic banner if they're taking a really big magic banner on the BSB, or just a weapon on a devastating character. Like all these things really impact how your opponent's character and army is going to function. And a lot of armies really are counting on the characters to deliver a lot of damage. So if you're hindering your opponent's ability to do that, I think it's really powerful. The number 6 spell is Fiery Convocation. This is an amazing spell. It's direct damage, 24-inch range. Every model in the unit is going to take a strength 4 hit with the flaming attack special roll. And it remains in play, which, can be a mixed bag, but in this case, I just think remains in play on this is just awesome, because in every subsequent magic phase, both yours and your opponent's, at the end of it, every model takes a strength 4 hit again until it's dispelled. So if you manage to cast this during your magic phase, right, either you roll double 6s and your opponent can't stop it, or your opponent tries to stop it and fails, that's probably the nightmare scenario for your opponent. They have to then deal with this in their magic phase. They cannot let this just go on in perpetuity. So not only is it doing damage in your magic phase, dispelling this is going to take so many of your opponent's dice. Essentially, they're going to have to forfeit their next magic phase in order to get rid of it. So just extremely powerful in that sense too. That not only is it doing damage, but it's also providing you with some magical defense. In the 4 spot, we have the Lore of Vampires. Starting off with the lore attribute, which I think is really great, especially for the army. It synergizes with the army just so well, right? So this lore is only going to be used by vampire counts. And the lore attribute, it heals either the wizard or another model within 12 inches by 1 point every time you're casting a spell. And you're going to be casting a lot of these spells. So vampires, they're already hard to kill. The vampire counts have a lot of monsters that can already be difficult to kill. The Terrorgeist is kind of hard to take down. The Mortis Engine is really hard to take down. So just when you're kind of whittling those things down, all of a sudden your opponent can just pump them back up, and it can be just really frustrating to face. So the lore attribute's amazing for this army. The signature spell is Invocation of Nehek. I think you're almost always taking it. It's an amazing signature spell. It's an amazing spell in general. It allows you to heal units within 6 inches, all units, but that can be boosted up to 18 inches. So 18 inches, if your wizard's in the center of your army, you might be hitting your whole army with this thing. So it definitely can sway things in your way. Infantry units are being healed D6 plus the wizard's level. So if your wizard's level 4, that's potentially 10 guys. That's a lot. And then even like Black Knights are being healed 1 plus the wizard's level. So a level 4 is bringing back 5 Black Knights. Now, units that are vampiric, ethereal, or large target are only getting healed by 1, but still adding 1 to all those guys within 18 inches. And then you also potentially have the lore attribute, which can add a 2nd wound. It's just amazing. All right, the number 1 spell is very good. Van Hel's Dance of Macabre. It's casting on a 6+. And it has a 12-inch range. It's an augment, and the target unit is going to re-roll to hit rolls until the next friendly magic phase. So that's going to impact 2 combats potentially, right? The combat right after your magic phase plus your opponent's turn. This can actually be boosted to affect all units within 12 inches, and it casts on a 12+, which I think is just a steal, an extremely good spell. In fact, looking at this lore, I always want to take the signature spell, I think, but it's hard to even, really contemplate which spell you're swapping because they're all so good. The last thing I'll point out about Van Hel's is that it also allows for an 8-inch move if your target is unengaged, right? So if you're going up against a gun line and you're just trying to get up there and you bubble this thing to hit all units within 12 inches, you not only can you do your regular movement, but then another 8 inches, and all of a sudden you're just on your opponent. Hellish Vigor, very similar to Van Hel's. It is an augment. It is allowing the unit to re-roll to wound rolls in close combat until the next friendly magic phase. And it can be boosted to impact all units within 12 inches. If you get Van Hel's and this off on one or multiple units, look out. Like, that is just potent as all get out. An exceptionally good spell. Gazing of Goss, just a handy magic missile here. 2d6 strength, 4 hits. This is number 3 spell. It has a 24-inch range, and that can be boosted to 48-inch. So 48 inches is very good for range, and it's only casting on a 9+, so I think that that's a great option as well. All right, so Raise Dead is a sneaky good spell, and it's creating a unit of zombies. Now, zombies are trash. They're horrible. They're not good troops at all. So I think some people maybe look at this spell and go, zombies aren't going to make a big difference. But what this spell is sneaky good at is just creating a unit that is chaff, and you get to choose what angle it's at. So you can create a unit, put it at a funny angle, and all of a sudden your opponent's frenzied unit that's kind of threatening your flank or certain area is going off in some crazy direction. So it's just a speed bump. It's a hassle for your opponent. The other thing that's really nice about this spell is that you cast it and you're not telling your opponent where you're placing that unit. So they have to decide whether or not to dispel it without really knowing what the spell is going to do. I mean, they know it's going to create a unit, but they don't know where that unit's going to be. They don't know what that unit's facing is going to be. So it forces them to make a decision on the dispel without really having all the information like they normally would for other spells. Now, granted, okay, a magic missile, they don't know how many hits are going to be rolled. So it's not like you always know what the spell is going to do, but hexes and augments you do. Magical vortexes, oftentimes you do. You may not know how far they're going to go. But there's a lot of mystery when your opponent's deciding whether or not to dispel this. So I like it in that regard as well. All right, Curse of Years is another one of these cool remains in play damage spells. It's a hex. It's a hex, though, that's doing damage. It has an 18-inch range. When you cast it, every model in the unit is taking a wound on a d6 roll of 6. And there are no armor saves for this. So that's the no armor save aspect makes this a lot more appealing, in my opinion. And then it's remains in play. So in subsequent magic phases, the wound goes, the to wound roll goes down by 1. So the next time you're rolling on it, it's a 5+, and then the time after that's a 4+. Granted, these are not going to come up because your opponent's going to have to dispel this. Otherwise, the unit's just going to get deleted. But like I said earlier with the number 6 High Elf spell, this just forces your opponent then, if they allow you to cast it, they're having to deal with this during their magic phase, which means they have to commit their dice to it. And committing dice during your magic phase to dispelling means you're not attacking, which is a huge win. All right, so the number 6 spell is Wind of Death. I have to admit, for number 6 spell, this is a little underwhelming for me. I don't think it really compares in power to some of the other magical vortexes, and it's just kind of meh. I'm even potentially swapping out the number 6 spell for the signature spell, because I think the other spells maybe are more versatile and outshine it in certain regards. It's a good spell, so I don't want to poo-poo it too much. But compared to some of the other level 6 spells, not amazing. In the number 3 spot, we have the Lore of Death. And looking at the lore attribute, which is life leeching, any unsaved wound that you're doing with spells from the Lore of Death, you roll 5 or 6 on a d6 for those unsaved wounds, and it adds an additional die to your power pool. So this has the potential of just allowing you to cast all of your spells depending upon, the fate of luck. And it definitely has to factor into your opponent's decision on which spells to stop, especially early on. So I think as a lore attribute, I would say it's very good. All right, the signature spell is Spirit Leech. I think the signature spell is very good. It allows you to target a single model, even a character in a unit. Its range is kind of limited. It's 12 inches. You can boost it to 24, so you're probably generally having to boost this unless you're just in really close proximity. And what you do is you roll a d6, and your opponent rolls a d6, and you add the leadership value of the wizard to the attacking player's d6, and you add the unmodified leadership value of the target. And if the wizard beats the roll, by every point it beats it by, it's doing a wound. So that's really swingy, right? If as the attacking wizard you roll a d6 and you roll a 1, then you're probably not doing any damage. Likewise, if your opponent rolls a 6, you're probably not doing any damage. So it has the potential of just murdering your opponent's BSB, or, potentially just offing their general or a support character or something to that effect. But then it also has the potential of not doing anything. So it's one of those things that your opponent potentially can let through and just kind of gamble on it. And yeah, I don't know. I probably am using my dice elsewhere, but I do think it is a good spell. All right, number 1, Aspect of the Dread Knight. I actually don't like this spell at all. So I know I had the lore ranked really high. This for me is an auto swap to the signature spell. It's giving your unit fear. It's not impactful enough in my opinion to really matter. Fear is only going to come into play if your opponent fails that check. They probably have the BSB. It's just not great. Even terror, if you boost it, likewise, it's just so random. So I'm not wasting my dice casting the spell typically. The number 2 spell is the Crest of Lanif, and this is another one that allows you to target a single enemy model, even a character inside a unit. If you cast it, you roll 2d6, and you're deducting the target's strength. And this is going to be their unmodified strength, right? So if they're wielding a great weapon, that's not going to go into this. So it's just their base stat strength. So usually on a fighty character, you're probably looking at a 4, maybe a 5. And then on something like a wizard, you're probably looking at a 3. So I think this is a great spell if you want to kill like a wizard. 2d6, it's a little random, but you're expecting a probably average roll of 7. And then whatever you beat it by, you roll those dice, those hits, and they're doing a wound on a 4+ with no armor saves allowed. So that's pretty handy. And the fact that this lore lets you kind of snipe characters are really powerful, whether they're combat characters or wizards. So a great spell. It can be boosted to 24-inch range. The number 3 spell is Soul Blight. Just an incredible spell. And I know earlier I talked about, ranking lores and thinking about, does the lore have a game-winning spell? I actually think the Lore of Death has 2 game-winning spells. Soul Blight really strikes me as one of these. It is a hex spell. It has a 24-inch range. And it gives the unit -1 strength and -1 toughness. The thing that makes it a game-winning spell for me is the fact that you can bubble this to affect all enemy units within 24 inches, potentially your opponent's entire army. And you could have a handful of combats going on, and you're casting a spell that is greatly impacting all of them. Just absolutely devastating, absolutely amazing. All the things that make Whistling Wild Form a really great spell are true for Soul Blight. It's just rather than enhancing your unit, you're doing a similar thing by hexing your opponent's units. I love this spell. Doom and Darkness, the number 4 spell, is a great spell. It's a remains in play spell, and it's giving the target unit -3 penalty to its leadership value. And your opponent's going to have to dispel it at some point. So if you cast it, it's just there until your opponent deals with it. It's got a 24-inch range, which can be boosted to 48. And of course, that couples very nicely with Spirit Leech. So if you do this and then Spirit Leech, yowzers. It changes Spirit Leech maybe from a coin toss to almost insta-kill. So those synergize really well. And there's just some armies that are going to be terrified by this. Even Warriors of Chaos, right? They're going to be really scared of this. Orcs and Goblins, Ogres. There's plenty of armies that don't have access or have really hard access to 10 leadership and just going to be devastated. A very useful spell. All right, the number 5 spell is the Fate of Bajuna. And this is the only thing I don't like about this spell, in fact, is the range. It's a 12-inch range, which is tough pill to swallow. So you got to be right up there. You're within charge range most likely if you're casting this. But you know what? It's good enough to justify it. You're picking out an individual model, can be a character or a unit, and you're doing a number of hits equal to 2d6 minus the target's toughness. And these are wounding on a 2+, so most of these are going to wound. It allows for no armor saves. So yeah, you can just totally snipe out that character. And the target, if it survives, is subject to stupidity for the remainder of the game. So yeah, that also couples nicely with Doom and Darkness, right? Because then you're lowering the leadership. They might fail that check. So a really handy spell. The Purple Sun of Xerius is the number 6 spell, one of the more brutal spells in the game. This is really terrifying. It is a magical vortex, and it's moving artillery die ×3. So, average roll on the artillery die is probably 5-ish. So 15, maybe 18 inches. So you do have to be close proximity to really ensure it's going to hit your target. But if you go over the target with this template, every model passed over has to take an initiative test, and if they fail, they are slain outright with no saves of any kind, no armor, no ward. So initiative test, depending upon your matchup, like Ogres are going to be terrified by that. Orcs and Goblins are going to be terrified by that. There's plenty of stuff out there that's really punchy, that has lots of models with low initiative. So yeah, just devastating. The fact that it allows for no saves of any kind really is the tipping point. One of the more powerful spells in the game. All right, jumping over to the 2 spot, we have the Lore of Shadow. Looking at the lore attribute, we have Smoke and Mirrors. This is allowing the wizard to swap places with another friendly character within 18 inches. And, I look at this and I kind of think, all right, maybe situationally it's good, but for me, in terms of the lore attribute. The signature spell, Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, is just a really nice hex spell. Easy to cast on a 5+. It's got a 48-inch range, and you're reducing the target's weapon skill, ballistic skill, initiative, or movement by D3. You can cast a more powerful version of the spell for a 10+ and reduce all 4 stats by D3. So it's got a good effect, amazing range, 48-inch range. I love it. And yeah, it's just easy to cast. A 5+, you can throw 1 die at it, and most of the time you're going to get it. Steed of Shadow is the number 1 spell. Again, another spell that's easy to cast on a 5+. The wizard or another friendly character within 12 inches immediately makes a move using the fly special rule. So, I think situationally, depending upon the build, it can be useful. It's not the most exciting spell in the lore for me. The number 2 spell, Enfeebling Foe. This one's casting on a 10+. It's a hex, range of up to 18 inches, can be boosted to 36 inches. Only casting value of 13 if you need to boost it. It remains in play. So again, I really don't mind remains in play spells, because if I cast it, my opponent has to dispel it at some point, which means they're sacrificing future resources. And they might forget, and then it's just kind of hanging around there. And this was reducing the target's strength by D3. So reducing strength has a huge impact on a combat. I really like this spell a lot. What's better than reducing strength? Reducing toughness. The Withering, number 3 spell. Cast on a 13+. Again, remains in play like Enfeebling Foe. Same range. Can be boosted also to 36. This is reducing the target's toughness by D3. So these 2 things synergizing really well. The Withering's also great if you have some shooting elements in your army and you know what your target's going to be, and you can knock that toughness down even before the 2 armies have met in the center here. Just a really awesome spell. The number 4 spell I'm not super great about, Pendulum. This spell situationally might be okay. I really dislike the random range. You might go with something that's average or a little less than average and still miss it just with the range itself. And they're still getting a lookout Sir roll, Situationally might be okay, but in general, I think this is probably one that I'm swapping for the signature spell. So number 5, we got Pit of Shades. To me, this is potentially a game-winning spell, potentially a unit-deleting spell, essentially. So you have the small round template, and it's going to scatter d6 inches. Everything that's hit takes initiative test, and if they fail, they're dragged to their doom. No saves of any kind. This can be boosted to use the large round template, and it's, in that case, going to scatter 2d6. I'm not crazy about scattering 2d6, but you do have like a 33% chance of it just rolling the hit and not scattering at all. Now, plenty of armies are just terrified about this spell right out of the gate, because you have plenty of low initiative armies, ogres, orcs and goblins, etc. But this spell synergizes so well with the signature spell, right? Because you can throw a miasma out there on that first turn, and the armies aren't even near each other, and your opponent might be thinking, yeah, I don't care if you lower my initiative. But you've got in the back of your mind, once I get your initiative lowered by D3, I'm hitting you with a Pit of Shades. All of a sudden, even your elves, right? If you get you get the 5 or 6 on the D3 and you're reducing it by 3, now even your elves have a really low initiative, and even a really fast unit now has to be terrified of Pit of Shades. And they just synergize so well together. I really like the spell quite a bit. All right, the number 6 spell, again, another potential game winner here. We have Occam's Mind Razor. This is an augment spell. It's got a range of 18, can be boosted at 36. Effectively, the target's strength is now equal to their leadership. So even if you're looking at an average leadership, 7, maybe 8 for some troops, like let's say the general's not there, you're still 7 or 8 strength, right? I mean, that's incredible. And some of the armies that can take the Lore of Shadow, you're talking about all of the elf armies. So the things with like fast attacks, with rerolls to hit, that maybe have low strength, they are benefiting from this hugely. Anything that has hatred, benefiting from this hugely. Anything that has frenzy, benefiting from this hugely. But yeah, there is no troop that isn't suddenly turned into an elite troop with this spell. And it sways that combat. It's potentially devastating for that unit that's fighting your now monstrosity of a unit. All right, without further ado, the number 1 lore in Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition is the Lore of Life. Looking at the lore attribute, Life Bloom, the wizard can heal any single model within 12 inches by 1 point every time they cast a spell from the Lore of Life. And this can include the wizard himself. So this is just awesome, right? If you're by the steam tank, if you're by a monster, if you're by a demigryph, this can just be devastating for your opponent. And a lot of the armies that can take Lore of Life have access to these models that are going to greatly benefit from Life Bloom. The signature spell is Earthblood. It's casting on an 8+. It's giving the unit that the wizard's in a 5-up regen. So I think that this is situational. For certain builds, for certain wizards, it's not particularly useful, like the Treeman Ancient. Not really that helpful at all. And now if your wizard is in a combat unit and is kind of moving up there and getting into the fray, and you can throw a 5-up regen on your unit, I think it's great. So situationally, I think it's good, and then sometimes kind of meh. Out of all the signature spells on all the lists, I think this was probably the one that excites me the least, but the other spells are just so good. The number 1 spell is Awakening of the Wood, a direct damage spell, range of 18 inches. I would love to see that range a little higher, but it's very easy to cast on a 6+. It's doing D6 strength 4 hits, and those are 2d6 if the target is even partially within a forest. If I have a build or a situation where I think Earthblood is particularly useful, this is probably the spell that I'm swapping for it. It is a useful, decent spell, but yeah, if Earthblood is an option for me that is going to work well, probably swapping the number 1. The number 2 spell is an augment spell, range 24 inches, flesh to stone. This is adding +2 to the target's toughness. +2 toughness, yikes. Even elves are now toughness 5, hello. Orcs aren't going to have the spell, unfortunately, but things that are toughness 4 or going up to toughness 6, etc., that's just devastating for a combat. And it's super easy to cast on an 8+. The range is good. I love it. The number 3 spell is actually one of my favorite spells in the lore. It provides a lot of utility. It remains in play, so if you get it off, your opponent's got to deal with it at some point. And again, if they let this thing hang around to your next magic phase, they might deeply regret it. It's casting on an 8+. It remains in play. It's going to affect the casting wizard. That wizard now ignores miscasts on a 2+. So you can throw just a couple dice at this. Like say you get 8 power dice. You can throw a couple dice at this and then 6 dice at dwellers. Right? Your opponent probably is saving the dice for the dwellers. And then all of a sudden, you're hoping for the double 6s because 5 out of 6 times you're not going to be impacted by it. And your other spells are also boosted by this, right? The Earthblood goes from a 5-up regen to a 4-up. The Damage Awakening of the Wood is now strength 6. Celestial Stone, instead of +2 toughness, is +4. Your healing spell gets better. Your Shield of Thorns spell gets better, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So it synergizes really well with the lore. It's healing that single model. You're getting the lore attribute, easy to cast. Your opponent has to deal with it at some point, but may sacrifice the future just to have an easier time dealing with their magic phase in the present. Love this spell. The number 4 spell, Shield of Thorns, again, remains in play, which I actually don't mind, right? Because your opponent has to deal with it at a later date. And it's got a range 24 inches. It's an augment spell. And at the end of every magic phase, if an enemy unit's in base contact with a target, they're suffering 2d6 strength 3 hits, boosted to strength 4 if you have Throne of Vines. So just handy, right? Just annoying, right? Something that remains in play. If your unit's already in combat, then they're about to get hit by it, that phase too. Or you can just throw on a unit early and your opponent has to deal with it at some point. Or, by the way, yeah, this thing's going off and it goes off in your magic phase. It also goes off in your opponent's magic phase. So there's scenarios where like maybe you cast this and your opponent's thinking, oh, I'll dispel on my turn. And then they roll Snake Eyes for their Winds of Magic. And all of a sudden, dispelling this is not automatic. A really good spell. All right, the number 5 spell, Regrowth, putting models back on, just super useful. It's a healing spell. It is allowing you to recover D3 +1 wounds worth of models slain earlier in the battle. Cavalry are counting as 2. And it has a range of 24 inches, can be boosted to 48. Now, if you have Throne of Vines, you're doing D6 +1. And then, of course, you're also getting the lore attributes. So you're able to heal a single model within 12 inches. Just synergizes super well. Putting models back on is just amazingly good. All right, the number 6 spell, the Dwellers Below, in my opinion, the most powerful, the best spell in all of Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition. Really kind of terrifying to face. The Dwellers Below is a direct damage spell. It is requiring the target, every model in the target, to pass a strength test or be slain with no saves of any kind allowed. It's got a short range of 12 inches, but that can be boosted to 24, and you're looking at a casting value of 21+. If you're casting this, you're probably throwing 6 dice at it anyways. You're probably hoping for the double 6s, especially if you have Throne of Vines up. But yeah, characters in a huge unit just make for a great target. And even a fighty character that's strength 4 or 5, they are going to roll at 6 sometimes. And it doesn't matter if they have a ward save, doesn't matter what their armor is. Big units of elite troops. Oh my goodness. Even if they have a decent strength, right? Even if they're strength 4, you're going to kill a third of the unit. That's incredible. So a chance to just one-shot the characters. Yeah, just cripple units. And then you're going to have plenty of elite troops that are strength 3, right? Especially with the elves, witch elves, spring to mind. As well as other types of elves. Their base strength may not be that great. Sword masters, right? If your opponent's throwing down a huge block of sword masters. So it's just situationally amazing, but it's never bad. And you always got to be mindful of it. And it's certainly a game-winning spell, the most powerful spell in my opinion. I do actually rank it a lot higher than some of the magical vortexes, right? Even if you compare it to Purple Sun. If you roll a misfire to determine the distance on Purple Sun, then it's hitting your own guys, right? It's getting centered over your wizard. And yeah, that's obviously not great. This is never going to harm your own guys. I mean, you do have to deal with the miscast, but that's going to be true of any spell that you're throwing 2 dice at. And yeah, it's just really reliable and really powerful and just absolutely devastating. You have the chance of killing multiple characters and neutering a unit. It's hard to pass on that. If you think I got any of these wrong, if I omitted a lore that you think should have been on the list, definitely post it up in the comments. Let me know your thoughts. Again, this list obviously is subjective, so hopefully you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.